Today is Wednesday, July 13th, 2011. Some interesting things happening with regards to yours truly, your humble radio host. Kind of cool. I played that clip yesterday from the Judge Andrew Napolitano show, where I guess the thesis that I put forth in my book, Teocon, about the neocon infiltration into the Tea Party, that thesis is getting a lot of play. All of a sudden, it's really blowing up. So, if you didn't hear yesterday's show, I'll just play a short clip where both Napolitano and Ron Paul discuss these issues.
Is the Tea Party movement being taken over by neoconservatives? If you recall, the movement originally began as a grassroots revolution in support of Congressman Ron Paul and his ideas about constitutional government not too long ago in 2007. Since then, and more recently, the Tea Party movement has taken on a life of its own. It is still a populist uprising against the establishment. But now certain political parties are attempting to control it, to benefit themselves and their candidates, and to use it as a tool against their opponents. Congressman Paul is not happy by some in the Tea Party movement and some Tea Party Republicans he's facing in his own upcoming election. He's also unhappy with the latest from the Federal Reserve. Who wouldn't be? Are you ready for this? Should the central bank be bailing out Greece? Isn't that a matter for Congress to decide? Doesn't that affect foreign policy? Joining me now on the phone is one of the great defenders of freedom and constitutional government in Congress today, Congressman Ron Paul from Texas. Congressman Paul, it's a pleasure. Welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thank you, Judge. Good to be with you.
Let's start with the Tea Party movement. You and I have spoken to them. I have spoken to them many times in your home state. The feeling and reception that I have gotten is one that is very consistent.
Anyway, you can find this clip on my Facebook page. You can find it on YouTube. It's called Tea Party Movement is Infiltrated by Neoconservative Influence and Candidates, which is essentially, again, my book, Teocon, was actually the first book published on the entire Tea Party movement. I think I beat the guys who do all the polling, the public polling. They had a book. I beat them by like a month, I think. But nonetheless, what I'm excited to say is that it's clearly this is the thesis of my book, and it is being now spoken of largely. And as a matter of fact, speaking of my Facebook, I posted this yesterday, and my fellow Utah and libertarian, although I think he's a small L libertarian, I haven't convinced him to become a big L out of the closet libertarian yet. Spencer Morgan, he even mentioned, he said, I was thinking the same thing, Jake. This is right in line with your book, and you called it way ahead of time. So I'm glad that it's not lost on everybody, and I'm glad that the thesis that I put forth is now getting the attention that it deserves, that we as liberty-minded people have to be exceedingly cautious about the neocons, the influence of neoconservatism upon this new populist libertarian movement, the Tea Party, the Libertarian Party, all this kind of stuff, the Campaign for Liberty, and whatnot. So it made me very excited to see that. Now, to further evidence the influence, I actually got a phone call this morning from a woman from Germany. She's an author and a publisher. She has her own publishing imprint called Berlinica, and she's writing a book on the Tea Party and called to interview me today. So all the way from Germany, believe it or not, Berlin. So that was kind of exciting. And then I'm so thrilled to be libertarian in these times. It's trendy, okay? And so people, for example, I got off a little bit ranting again about Glenn Beck. And you know what? Maybe his newfound libertarianism that he claims to be practicing is sincere. I highly doubt it. He's proven, if you're a sincere person, you don't need to rub Vicks Vapor Rub under your eyes to cry. So, I'm a little unconvinced. But, hey, I could be wrong. Maybe he will be. he has done two good things. He's given Judge Andrew Napolitano a show. That's good for liberty. And he actually got F.A. Hayek on the bestsellers list. Now, I played that clip yesterday. He also supported the Patriot Act. He supports the bailout. I think that his promotion of tyranny far outweighs the promotion of liberty. But, he has promoted liberty more than, say, like a Hannity or Limbaugh or any of those other windbags. So I do have to say, though, somebody like Beck, I'm open-minded. If you prove it to me, it's like a liar. If somebody has chronically lied to you over and over and over and over again, you would be stupid to trust them right out of the bag. Now, I am all about redemption. If they prove it, if they actually take some effort to prove it, that they're trustworthy and honest and sincere, hey, man, as soon as it's proved, I'm there. I will be your biggest supporter. I'll be your biggest friend. That's how some of my greatest friends, I've become close friends with some of my people that I had biggest issues with, and they proved to me that they were indeed sincere, that they were redeeming themselves, and I've become very close. I have very close friends that I've made friends that way. So I would more than welcome Beck into the fold, but he certainly has a ginormous hole to dig himself out of if that is the case. I just still am completely unconvinced. Anyway, I was libertarian far before the Tea Party, before any of this stuff, and I'll be libertarian probably after the trendiness. Hopefully the trendy nature of it won't die off, but I know I will be libertarian for the rest of my life. But I have to say, I've been libertarian for probably close to 20 years, and I've never seen the ideas as openly discussed and accepted, and such great caliber of minds. There's always been great thinkers involved with the classical liberal tradition or the libertarian tradition, but now we're getting a bigger proportion, a larger number of these great minds. And one of them is, he calls himself the Southern Avenger. His name's Jack Hunter. I wanted to play this clip because I think it really sets people straight. Ron Paul, yes, he's running as a Republican. He's a Republican congressman, but he is an anomaly. There is no other Republican except maybe his son, Rand Paul, and Mike Lee is actually proving to be quite a great advocate for liberty. Time will tell. He's still relatively new, so I don't want to give him a pass. But these guys are anomalies. The rest of the Republicans are a bunch of neocons, neoconservatives. So here we go. Jack Hunter really breaks this down. Now, you can go and buy my book, which I would recommend you do. Again, first book on the Tea Party, stood up very well. Forward by David Gordon from the Mises Institute, senior fellow. It's getting great reviews. People love it. Again, people in Germany, I had an author call me today about it. It's the thesis is getting pushed on even on the enemy station, as enemy as I see it, Fox Business. But yeah, so if you want to get a copy, go to mentalselfdefense.com. Scroll down, you'll see the book there. It takes you to the Amazon page. But that said, I want to play this clip from Jack Hunter. I think it explains things very nicely. He explains
the great neocon, libertarianism isn't conservative, by the Southern Avenger. During a question and answer session at this year's Conservative Political Action Conference, one man opined, quote, "One thing I've learned here at CPAC is that the C actually doesn't stand for libertarianism. It's not LPAC." When Congressman Ron Paul won the annual straw poll at CPAC, talk host Rush Limbaugh made a point to tell his listeners that CPAC wasn't conservative this year because a libertarian had won. Both men are worse than just wrong, they're on crack. Probably the most popular and cited history of American conservatism, George H. Nash's book, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America, begins in 1945, and it begins with libertarianism. Titled, quote, "The Revolt of the Libertarians," the second paragraph of Nash's first chapter states, quote, "Though believed in the creed of old-fashioned, classical, 19th century liberal individualism. 1945 was especially lonely, unpromising, and bleak Free markets, private property, limited government, self-reliance, laissez-faire. It had been a long time since principles like these guided government and persuaded peoples. Chronicling the intellectuals who tried to rectify this bleakness, Nash begins his history with two men, economists F.A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. And these two libertarian heroes kick-started the American conservative movement.
Okay, look, that needs emphasis. F.A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises kick-started the American conservative movement. Do you understand what he's saying there? Okay, I'm going to let Jack Hunter continue.
Few actually used the word conservatism in 1945, a term that began to gain popularity when Russell Kirk's book, The Conservative Mind, was published in 1953, and with the founding of William F. Buckley's National Review in 1955. Nash notes that even Kirk, who later had his own squabbles with fellow National Review writer and libertarian Frank Meyer, was first inspired by both Hayek and Mises, writing to a friend that these men represented a, quote, great school of economists of a much sounder and different mind. After Hayek and Mises, Nash then cites Albert J. Nock, publisher of the unabashedly libertarian magazine The Freeman in the 1920s. Writes Nash, quote, Nock came to exert a significant amount of influence on the post-war right, yet was so libertarian that, quote, Nock verged on anarchism in his denunciations of the inherently aggrandizing state. Noting the impression Nock made on a young Buckley, Nash explained that, quote, it was Knockian libertarianism, in fact, which exercised the first conservative influence on the future editor of National Review. Nash's entire book is a grand history of the mixture of conservatism and libertarianism, with the two often being indistinguishable. The American Spectator says of this work, quote, Nash's seminal book will remind today's hotheads that the modern conservative movement was made possible by a coalition of traditional and libertarians.
Yeah, so, the next time somebody starts telling you about, libertarianism, how bad it is, and they claim any kind of conservatism, you could point them to this video. Again, this is up on the Facebook. It's long. It's not super long. We're about halfway through, but it's about 7 minutes, and it is actually, I have to say, he did some really good research in showing the libertarian roots of the modern conservative movement, and he does continue to go and show the difference between the old school libertarian style conservatives and these neocons. This is a very, very good video. It's short, it's sweet. This is something you could pass to your friends, post on their, I don't know, if you're doing Google Plus now or Facebook or Twitter, whatever. This is a great, great short article that'll take 7 minutes. This is the kind of stuff, like why I wrote Teocon, to make a difference, to wake people up, to show them why this rhetoric of small government has to be matched by actual action. Okay, enough of my stumping. I am very thrilled to welcome to the show, and I'm gonna bring him on, but then we got to jump to a commercial break. But Jeffrey Rogers Hummell is a very smart guy, and he's been libertarian longer than I have. As a matter of fact, I first stumbled onto him in the mid to late 90s in San Francisco when I was living out there working at Laissez-Faire Books. He is a professor at San Jose State University. He has... The reason I'm bringing him on right now is because of the importance of this debt ceiling issue. And Jeff has been calling this since at least 1993, as far as I can tell. So when we come back from the break, I'm going to introduce you to Jeffrey Rogers Hummell. He has been predicting that the U.S. government's going to default on debts for a long time. This guy is an expert. So I'd really recommend you get your phones ready and whatnot. We're going to try to let you talk to him as well. Come on back. Mental Self-Defense Radio.
AM 630, K-Talk. Utah's most experienced talk radio team. Now at k-talk.com.
Is it about time to put in a new floor? Nothing compares to the quality, look, and feel of a genuine wood floor. And when it comes to quality, selection, and service, there's nobody that compares to the Wood Floor Warehouse, Utah's #1 locally owned wood floor superstore. Save up to 70% on factory direct wood flooring. Whether you're looking for professional installation or you're a do-it-yourselfer, the Wood Floor Warehouse is your answer. With any order, attend a free installation class, and your tool rental is also free. Or just leave your installation to the fine craftsmen of the Wood Floor Warehouse. The choice is yours. For the largest selection, best price, and friendly people who really value your business, drop on by to one of the Wood Floor Warehouse's 2 locations. In Salt Lake City between 4500 South and 3900 South, just west of I-15, and in Ogden at 5280 Freeway Park Drive. Check them out online, woodfloorwarehouse.com, or call toll-free 1-877-778-WOOD. That's 1-877-778-WOOD. 1-877-778-WOOD.
Hey, this is Jake the Computer Guy from PC Laptops. Turn up your radio. It's our once-a-year insane Mega Deluxe Summer Sale at PC Laptops on the best desktop and notebook computers on the planet. Remember, all PC Laptops computers come with a free lifetime service guarantee. That means if you get malware, spyware, or if your weird brother-in-law messes up your computer, you're covered forever for free. Now that's peace of mind. Have new gadgets? No problem. We'll set them up on your PC Laptops computer for free. We've got demos, scratch and dents, and trade-ins for up to 50% off the original prices. You have an old computer you want to put down? No problem. We take any brand of computer on trade. We'll even transfer all your pictures and files to your new PC Laptops computer for free. And to make it extra sweet, we're doing 0 down, 0 interest financing for a whole year. Always see. Get into any one of our 9 locations right now. Or call us at 1-877-596-SAVE. That's 1-877-596-SAVE. Or check us out at PCLaptops.com, because at PC Laptops, we love you.
At Acme Heating and Air, we save you time and money. The state of Utah has an energy audit program that will pay you hundreds or thousands to have new energy-efficient equipment, windows, insulation, and more installed in your home. But funds are limited. So act now by calling Acme Heating and Air at 801-467-1050. With over 25 years of heating and air experience at Acme, we work extra hard to earn your trust and confidence. Plus, we pledge only drug-free employees with complete and comprehensive background checks. Right now, Acme has up to $2,000 in rebates for new furnaces and a brand new springtime AC special. Acme will chemically clean your outside AC unit and pressure check all lines and system components for just $78. Imagine that, just $78 to make sure your home and family are cool and comfy this summer. Call Acme Heating and Air today at 801-467-1050 for upfront pricing with no surprises. At Acme, if you're uncomfortable, so are we. Call today, 801-467-1050. That's 801-467-1050.
Let's be real. Smoking sucks. It's a nasty, expensive, unattractive, and thoroughly unhealthy habit. There's the acrid smell in your clothes and on your breath. Yuck. Not to mention the increased health risk that cigarette smoke presents to those nearest and dearest to you. Call Salt Lake City Family Hypnosis now for your free consultation to learn how you can quit today. 801-738-5390. That's Salt Lake City Family Hypnosis, 801-738-5390.
The Voice of Utah. AM 630 K-Talk.
K-Talk.com.
Number 1 for the most live, local, two-way talk.
All right, welcome back. Mental Self-Defense Radio. I'm your host, Jake Shannon. Okay, look, I am thrilled to have our next guest on. He's a friend of mine, but he's also a bit of a scarce commodity. We've been trying for a while to get him on, and he's a busy guy. He's a professor, all these kind of things. Jeffrey Rogers Hummell has been basically calling this whole debt disaster since 1993. And as a matter of fact, he's been actually, in libertarian circles at least, and economists in general, a lot of people are saying, oh, we're going to hyperinflate. This is going to be like Zimbabwe or whatnot. Well, Jeff is actually taking and has taken and made a strong case for a different scenario, the scenario where we actually repudiate our debt. And for those of you who don't know the word repudiate, which I like to say because it allows me to spit all over the microphone, it basically means that we're just going to say, sorry guys, we're not going to pay you back. It's essentially like bankruptcy. Now, Jeff, I actually owe a debt to Jeff because for two reasons. One, okay, so again, he's a lecturer at San Jose State University, or an associate professor of economics. But he's also a killer historian. He wrote a book called Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men, A History of the American Civil War, which basically shows, of other things, how the Civil War was a huge disaster for liberty, how Lincoln, in fact, wasn't a good guy, despite all the propaganda you might have learned in grade school. But the thing I took from that book was the bibliography. That's why every book I write now, it's like a third bibliography, because I really liked that. The other debt that I owe to Jeff, and then we'll bring him on, is that him, along with another very hardcore libertarian from Northern California, a guy named Joe Feurig, who, rest in peace, he passed away a couple years ago. Those two guys were the ones to convince me to get into graduate school, and so that's how I earned my Master of Science in Financial Engineering. So, okay, enough of that. Without further ado, let's welcome Jeff Hummell. Jeff, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, Jake. How you doing?
Hey, man, I'm doing super. It's great to talk to you.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Hey, I'm thrilled to be able to share you with this audience here, because your thinking has influenced me. I think, I really, to be honest, had kind of taken it for granted until I really started to think about this show, and I was like, man, I kind of owe this guy a little bit, because your ideas have really shaped a lot of the ways. I don't agree with anybody 100%. I mean, anybody. But a lot of your ideas have really shaped the way I perceive the world around us, and I think in a positive way. Besides, you're a big Oingo Boingo fan, so that's automatic points. But essentially, you've been predicting that the United States, that the U.S. government is going to default on all this massive debt. I mean, this is totally relevant. This is kind of cosmic timing that you're on now because of this whole debt ceiling stuff.
Right, yeah. In fact, what happened was I was giving a lecture at Golden Gate University, where I was teaching at the time in 1981, and it was a public lecture, the title of which was The National Debt, Good or Bad or Just Plain Ugly. And as I went through the exposition, toward the end I got a question, what I thought would happen given the enormous projected shortfall between revenues and government spending. And after thinking about it for a moment, I predicted that the U.S. government would default. And at the time, everybody thought I was crazy. And I believe I'm the first who's actually thought it was a realistic possibility that the U.S. government might default on its debt. Unfortunately, that, although I didn't write up that presentation, I still have a videotape copy of it. So
there's actually documented proof as far back as 1981, huh?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, there is.
Wow. And, I can understand the opposition, because let alone from the fact of all the hoo-ha patriotism that, we'll never default, that kind of silliness. But, the implication of us repudiating that debt, I'm thinking with, again, my finance hat on, that would totally change, because, what would happen to risk-free rates and all that, the ways that we actually value these products?
Right. It would necessitate an enormous restructuring both of the financial system and of the way government works.
And here we are.
And I think this is a problem that's not only facing the United States, but is also facing all of the social democracies, or nearly all of them.
Now, so people can understand the nuances of your argument, and granted, people who are listening here are not necessarily economics nerds like maybe you and I might be, but so if you could speak in broad terms, what is your basic argument? Why do you believe that we will not hyperinflate, or we will not figure some way out of this fiasco other than repudiation? Because you actually look at it as it's a moral thing to do. It's the right.
Right. Well, I've been predicting default since 1993. I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong date there. 1993 was when I gave the lecture at Golden Gate University.
93, okay.
Yeah, 1981 is actually when I wrote my first article on this subject. At that time, I wasn't predicting default, but I was advocating it.
Oh, interesting.
And maybe later we can get into the reasons why I think the long-run consequences of a government default will be desirable.
Yeah, so for people who are listening, this is kind of the positive versus normative type of argument that you started out saying, well, we should do it, and then eventually you're like, no, this is just going to happen. This is going to happen.
Well, basically the argument is as follows. Everybody now knows that government expenditures at the federal level are programmed to explode. And basically they're programmed to explode because of the entitlement program, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So even the Congressional Budget Office projects that even without interest on the national debt, government expenditures at the federal level, which are currently in the neighborhood of prior to the recent fiscal crisis, were a little bit above 20% of GDP, have to rise to 35% of GDP,
which is unprecedented, right?
Yeah, and that's outside of wartime. That's unprecedented. That's a conservative estimate. So basically, what you have is these entitlement programs that have made a lot of promises to people in the future, but the taxes. The projected taxes in the future are not sufficient to cover them. And I guess it's easiest to explain through the Social Security system. The Social Security system is often portrayed as a government-run pension program or a government-run retirement fund. And it would be that if it was run on a fully funded basis. In other words, a normal pension fund, you save money, you earn interest, and then you live off the accumulated total that arises from the interest earnings on the savings. But Social Security, right from the get-go, has always been run on a pay-as-you-go basis.
Yeah, so maybe the listeners understand better, instead of having like an actual account where all my money that's been taken out when I look at my paycheck for Social Security actually goes into my account, it's just a transfer payment, right?
Right. Mostly. There are trust funds, but they've never been large enough to cover all of the future obligations.
I see.
And so essentially it's run like a chain letter. Or a chain email, I guess nowadays.
Yeah.
And in order to get even a modest rate of return on a chain letter, you have to keep increasing the revenue that comes in at the front end.
Which, especially when you look at these population dynamics about, the generations with the baby boomers being so big and the next generation not being so big.
Yes. So as a result, these programs create what in technical economic terms or financial terms are known as an unfunded liability or an actuarial deficit. And that means that's the present value of the shortfall. In other words, we know what the present value of future taxes are, we know what the present value of future expenditures are, and there's this huge gap. And that gap exists even though it will cause problems in the future. There's a sense in which it already exists in the present. In other words, it represents the amount by which future taxes have to rise or future expenditures have to fall, or some combination of the two. There is no other alternative.
And so basically we are going to have to, in order to make up that shortfall, we'd have to just be taxed to death. Literally.
We'd have to either increase government revenue or renege on the promises or some combination of both things.
Okay, and so...
And so if we look at the revenue side, there are basically three ways the government can generate revenue. Actually, there's a fourth way that's not that important. The government can sell goods and services like a private firm. The post office sells stamps, and the agriculture department sells pamphlets, and the state of California sells lottery tickets, but that's never been an important source of government revenue. So the three primary ways that government covers its expenditures are through taxes, through borrowing, and through the printing of money by the central bank. The technical term that economists use for printing of money, the revenue that it generates, is called seigniorage. Those are the three alternatives. Now, taxes, government borrowing. In order for the government to borrow, it has to pay interest, and in order to pay interest on the borrowing, it has to raise taxes. So you can think of borrowing as representing future taxes.
Yeah, because the taxpayer is the surety on that debt.
Right. The taxpayer has the liability. If I owe you $1,000 and you have an IOU, you have an asset, and it's my liability. So when the government borrows money, the holders of Treasury securities have the asset. The offsetting liability is the future taxes that the public has to pay. So you've got this enormous shortfall, and it's programmed to explode. And politicians don't seem to have very strong incentives to adjust the programs. So let's look at the sources of revenue. Taxes. If you look at U.S. taxes at the federal level, there's this astonishing statistic, which is that since the Korean War, federal taxes have been bumping up against about 20% of GDP over the entire subsequent period. And that's quite astonishing when you think about it, because tax rates go up, tax rates go down, but the total bite out of the economy remains fairly constant. And that suggests that there's a combination of a structural or a political limit to how high you can raise federal taxes.
Now those figures I did post on our Facebook page if anybody wants to follow along, because you're referencing that graph on the econlib.org article, right?
Right. Yes. So, and I don't see any prospect that taxes are going to go up sufficiently to cover those expenditures. In other words, the politicians are not going to cut the expenditures significantly. We can see this in the current debt ceiling brouhaha. They're not going to raise taxes significantly, and if they don't cut the entitlements, the extent to which they have to raise taxes is quite remarkably high. There are various estimates. There are conservative estimates, but a conservative estimate would be that federal total taxes at all levels of the U.S. government would have to rise, including state and local, would have to rise to about 45% of GDP. That's a conservative estimate.
And you were saying that 20% has been the norm in
at the federal level. If you add in state and local, you got to add in another 11 or 12% there. But at the state and local, at the federal level, it's been at 20% of GDP. So federally, it's going to have to rise to 35% of GDP, according to the Congressional Budget Office, not counting interest on the debt. You add in state and local, that's 45% of GDP. You're already talking about tax levels that are higher than during World War II, which represents the highest taxes have ever been as a percent of GDP in all of U.S. history.
And anybody, you don't even have to be an economist like yourself to understand that high taxes basically strangle the entrepreneurs, who are the ones who really are the lifeblood of the economy.
Now, those are conservative estimates, and you have other less conservative estimates. For instance, Lawrence Kotlikoff, an economist at Boston University, I believe, if my memory is correct, has done what's known as generational accounting to look at the shortfall, and he has estimated that without any significant cuts in expenditures, taxes will have to rise to about 75% of GDP.
Fascinating stuff. We're bumping up against a commercial here.
Okay.
This is how we get our revenues, not by taxation, but by advertising. Hang on, everybody. We're talking with Jeffrey Rogers Hummell. This is the guy who has been calling this repudiation, bankruptcy of our nation for a long time. Come on back.
AM 630, K-Talk. Honest talk, serious solutions.
63% of Americans are overweight. If you've decided it's time to leave your flat behind, HipFit Weight Loss is for you. HipFit changes habits. Lose the bad habits, lose the weight. HipFit is guaranteed to make your weight loss successful and has absolutely no health risks. HipFit students are not required to count calories, weigh portions, or buy specialty food. Start losing weight immediately. Call 801-635-4488. HipFit is conveniently located at Salt Lake City Family Hypnosis. Ask about our Guaranteed to Stop Smoking program. 801-635-4488.
Tune in on Sundays at 4 p.m. to learn the latest cutting-edge science of health with your hosts Hugo Rodier, MD, and Gary Olson, DC, on the Integrative Health Show sponsored by Pioneer Comprehensive Medical Clinic in Draper. Our country is suffering from poor health due to nutritional, environmental, and stress problems. Learn how to address these problems and not rely on symptomatic treatments that often have too many side effects. The Integrative Health Show, Sundays at 4 p.m. on K-Talk AM 630.
The voice of Utah. AM 630 K-Talk.
K-Talk.com.
Number one for the most live, local, two-way talk.
All right, welcome back. Mental Self-Defense Radio. I'm your host, Jake Shannon. I am thrilled to have with me a gentleman who has really influenced my thought in a lot of different ways. Jeffrey Rogers Hummell is an associate professor over at San Jose State University. He was a professor at Golden Gate University, where I got my graduate degree. Jeff, are you still there with us?
Yes, I am.
So, okay, the long and short of it is that essentially
Americans are not going to put up with 75 taxes that are 75% of GDP. That's just
so
not
raising
happen.
raising taxes is out.
Raising taxes is out. It doesn't look like there's going to be any significant cut in these entitlement programs.
But what about all these libertarian economists, and all they can think about is, the Fed is going to inflate everything? What about that?
That's people who go with my analysis this far often say, well, then the Fed will just print up the money and generate high rates of inflation. But by printing up the money,
look at Zimbabwe and all.
And look at Zimbabwe, yeah. What this overlooks is that the nature of central banking has undergone some dramatic transformations over the last several decades, which have been accelerated by the recent financial crisis, with the result that the printing of money doesn't really generate that much revenue for the U.S. government. The highest that seigniorage printing of money, the highest level it reached in terms of a percent of government expenditures was actually during the Civil War, when the Union printed greenbacks to finance finance the war effort. It covered about 15% of the war's expenditures. During World War II, actually the estimate I gave in the article online was based on a textbook that gave an estimate that was too large, so I've revised the estimate. During World War II, the printing of money covered about 6% of government expenditures, which represents about, at that time, 3% of GDP. And during the great inflation of the 1970s, which some of your listeners may remember, when inflation hit double digits at least twice, despite that high rate of inflation, the revenue that the government generated only covered about 2% of its expenditures, which is about 0.5% of GDP. And this is not just true of the U.S., but it's true of all the developed countries. In all the developed countries, central bank printing of money only generates trivial amounts of revenue. So that if the Federal Reserve were to try to cover this gap by printing up money, the rates of inflation would have to be catastrophic. I estimate that the rate of inflation that would result from a Fed attempt to cover the shortfall would give us would continually triple the price level year after year, so that after 3 years, the value of the dollar will have fallen to about 2.5% of its current value.
Well, and I agree with you. I actually see deflation coming. I'm libertarian, you know me, and for me to say, oh no, I'm pretty sure it's deflation, not inflation. It's like blasphemy to
Right. Well, there are a few libertarians who agree with you, and that's another issue we can talk about in a moment. But and I go into the reasons why central banks are not very good at generating revenue. It has to do with the development of sophisticated financial systems and fractional reserve banking and the globalization of the economy, of the world economy.
Now, that's not to say either you or I advocate central banking. I don't think you're a central banking person, right?
All I'm saying is that, I think central banking creates enormous problems, but the nature of the problem has changed, and critics of central bank have not kept up with, are not entirely on top of the changes.
Can I just say this, and then I'll stop interrupting you, because I think that what has happened here, at least amongst libertarians, is that, Murray Rothbard passed away before he understood derivatives and before, all this kind of stuff came around.
Right.
And he was an influential guy and wrote well of that, yes, there are problems with the Fed, but though, like you've said, it's different now.
It's different.
That's not the same problem.
Yeah, and not the same problem. In other words, it's not theoretically impossible that the Fed could unleash the Zimbabwe option.
Yeah, but it's not theoretically impossible that monkeys will fly out of my rear end.
But I just don't think it's very likely.
Right.
And one way to think about this is that, and if the Fed doesn't cover the difference, then we're faced with the only option left, which is Treasury default.
Now, for people listening, that's essentially bankruptcy.
That's essentially bankruptcy of the U.S. government, right? And government bankruptcy is not that common. Even before the Greek crisis, you've had a lot of instances, both in the 19th century and in the 20th century, of governments going bankrupt. Since World War II, usually, until recently, it has been less developed governments that have faced potential defaults, and international organizations like the International Monetary Fund have, and the U.S. government have bailed them out. But so it's not unprecedented for governments to get into this situation and for governments to go bankrupt. And basically, one way to think about this is, once this shortfall arises, the U.S. government could face a possibility where, if it defaults on its debt, it can at least save the dollar from hyperinflation. Or it could go through a hyperinflation, which is tantamount to defaulting on the debt anyway.
And then also destroy the dollar at the same time.
Yeah, and destroy the dollar at the same time.
And this is the case that I make. I make, the cui bono, who benefits case for deflation. Both the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve, and all the corporations with assets, all the banks with assets, they don't benefit from inflation at all. They benefit from the deflation of the existing dollars being worth more.
Well, I'm not sure I entirely agree with you about that. Okay. But to finish the story,
yeah.
See, I think that the current debt limit debate is more of a symptom. People are treating the potential refusal of Congress to raise the debt limit as a source of default. And it could cause a temporary not paying the government temporarily not paying interest on Treasury securities and some other stringency, but it isn't the underlying problem. The underlying problem is what is euphemistically called the fiscal imbalances, and unless those are corrected, at some point, sophisticated investors are going to recognize that U.S. debt is not that secure, and they're going to put a risk premium on Treasury securities. And then things will move very fast. It could be over as quickly as the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right.
You put a risk premium on Treasury securities, which means the interest on rolling over the debt goes up. The interest cost of rolling over the debt goes up, and with that happening, the situation gets worse, so it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle, and so default could be forced on the U.S. government before people really, before the politicians have any ability to respond in a sensible fashion, even if they wanted to.
Now you said that this has happened before in history.
I see partially, right? Financial markets, just as financial markets are currently in the process of constraining and disciplining the Greek government. I see them as constraining and disciplining eventually the U.S. government once this risk premium emerges on Treasury securities. Now
you had said that this is not totally anomalous in history, that the governments have defaulted on their debt, gone bankrupt.
Yes.
So what is that? What has happened traditionally when that has happened? I mean, like you mentioned, the Soviet Union. I mentioned that. That's how I almost. I try to be as optimistic as I can, but I really don't see any other way out. And it looks like the people were fine when the transition. Sure, there was a rough patch as the new government was coming in and whatnot. But what do you see as the ramifications of this repudiation?
Well, I think the long run result over the long run will be an end of the welfare state. In other words, I think social democracy, the welfare state, is going to go the way of the command economies. The command economies were economically unviable, and eventually the Soviet Union collapsed in a way that was completely out of control of the rulers of the Soviet Union. And I think that this looming debt crisis that, as I said, affects all of the welfare states will bring an end to the welfare state, with the result that you will have much more modest and more limited governments grabbing a much smaller proportion of the economy's total output, and as a libertarian, I think that's a desirable outcome.
So that is your moral argument to
that's
support
partially my moral argument. Let me give you one historical example. The state and local governments in this country faced a debt crisis in the 1840s. What had happened is that prior to that, as a result of canal building, spurred by the success of the Erie Canal built by New York, a lot of state governments had gone in heavily into debt to build a lot of economically unjustified canals, and there were other sources of the state government debt as well. And in the 1840s, you had a recession in 1837 and then a deflation that began in 1839, and many of the state governments ended up defaulting on their debts. And the political and economic consequences, as far as I'm concerned, were all beneficial. One consequence was that state governments, which then had been, essentially had socialized the development of canals, became very wary of making these kinds of expenditures on internal improvements, so that they were much more cautious in terms of how they promoted railroads, and left railroads not entirely but largely up to private enterprise rather than government sponsorship.
Now, but wait, let me ask you something. How does that play out with regards to foreign policy when, like, for example, China owns so much of this debt? I mean, that can't be good.
Well, yes and no. I mean, one of the reasons that I think default, one factor that makes default more likely is the fact that about one half of the outstanding debt is held abroad, and a large portion of that is held in China, which makes it more politically attractive for the U.S. to default. Now, that can create some foreign policy difficulties, but in the 1840s, a lot of the state debt was owned by British creditors, and they essentially took the hit, which meant they were much more wary of investing in state government subsequently. And the state governments, as a result, passed a lot of constitutional amendments that constrained spending and required balanced budgets at the state level, and we still have the lingering effects of that. That's why at the state level the fiscal crisis is much less severe than at the federal level, with some certain noteworthy exceptions like the state I'm in, California, because they still face constraints in terms of how much debt they can accumulate that are byproducts of political byproducts of this crisis in the 1840s.
This is fascinating because I really haven't. I'd always been more worried, but you're probably right that because when it would create a problem with foreign policy. But you look at China and they're going to say, "Okay, look, yeah, we're mad," and instead of them coming at us with a military, because we do still have a strong military, they probably won't go that option. They'll probably just be like, "Boy, we won't make that mistake and loan all that money to the U.S. again." Right. That's fascinating stuff. Now we're coming up against our long break. We've got.
Really? Already?
Yeah, it's going quick. Hour number 1 down. But I kind of try to take more of a Charlie Rose approach where I can get some in depth and allow the guests to really explain what they're talking about. So we'll come back after the break with Jeffrey Rogers Hummell talking about, where are we going to go? Is it going to be deflation? I also might pick his brain a little bit about why the Civil War was such a disaster for the United States. Come on back. Mental Self-Defense Radio. Come on back after the CNN feed.
AM 630, K-Talk. Utah's independent radio voice for 45 years.
What does local search sound like? Some sound like this. Notice the telltale sound of sluggishness. And now, the sound of search by Dex. Notice the syncopation of laptop, mobile phone, and print directory. Joining with the pulse beat of local businesses. A smattering of painters here. A timpani of tire guys there. Now, a domain of pizza makers. A brass section of plumbers. A buzz of groomers. And a clattering of chefs, TV repairmen, and bakers. All joined in a cachet of sales and swelling into a great crescendo that ends in a triumphant, successful search, all conducted by you. Everything that makes your world hum is here, in the book, on the phone, or online at dexknows.com. Need it? Dex it.
Wake up without yuck in your lungs or the dark cloud of lung cancer or heart disease looming over your future. Have the energy and health you deserve by simply calling Salt Lake City Family Hypnosis at 801-738-5390. Forget what you've seen from TV and the movies. Hypnosis is powerful and natural and has been accepted by the American Medical Association since the 1950s. Our methods have proven time and again to be more effective than pills, patches, gum, and willpower for quitting smoking. If you've tried the rest, now call the best. Salt Lake City Family Hypnosis, 801-738-5390. That's Salt Lake City Family Hypnosis, 801-738-5390. Be sure to ask about our proven weight loss and natural breast enlargement programs. Visit us online at slchypnosis.com.
You're listening to Utah's first #1 talk station. K-Talk, AM 630, KTKK, Sandy, Salt Lake City. The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
CNN Radio, I'm Michelle Wright. This hour's top Virginia Democrat, Senator Jay Rockefeller, is calling for an investigation into whether Americans may be victims of the phone hacking scandal involving the News Corp newspaper.
A lot of this stems from a report, at least one from the Daily Mirror in Great Britain, that a former New York policeman alleged that he was contacted by News of the World journalists some years ago who said they would pay him to retrieve the private phone records of some 9/11 victims.
That's CNN's Brian Todd reporting. A 35-year-old man has been arrested in the brutal killing and dismemberment of a young New York City boy. Police Commissioner Ray Kelly says 9-year-old Libby Kletsky was murdered after he apparently got lost and asked for help.
There is no indication at this time that the victim was known to the suspect previously.
Police say human remains were found in the suspect's freezer. Lawmakers are trying to come up with a plan to reduce the deficit and raise the debt ceiling. Senator Chuck Schumer says if the debt ceiling isn't raised, the government will have to make some tough calls about who to pay and who not to pay.
Do we pay the Social Security recipients and not the veterans? Do we say we'll pay veterans but not pay people who inspect food or guard our borders? The choices are awful.
The president and Republican leaders are meeting once again today to work on a deal. And a controversial Harvard study says in some cases, severely obese children would be better off if they were taken away from their parents and put into state custody. CNN's Elizabeth Cohen reports.
This is a pretty radical notion for what to do about childhood obesity, which everyone agrees is a huge problem. So what these researchers are basically saying is that in some cases where parents have not been able to help their kids lose weight, the state should step in and take those children away and put them in foster care where perhaps they would have a better chance of losing weight.
I'm Michelle Wright. This is CNN Radio.
Hi, welcome to Lowe's. How can I help you?
Yes, I heard about your 5% off everyday credit offer.
That's right. Just use your Lowe's consumer credit card to get 5% off every day. Or choose special financing on purchases of $299 or more.
5% off every day? So Columbus Day?
Discover all the things you can get 5% off on.
Arbor Day?
Buy a tree, get 5% off.
St. Patrick's Day?
You'll save lots of green with 5% off.
Awesome.
Lowe's. Let's build something together. Subject to credit approval. Offers cannot be combined. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.
Are you being audited? Have you not filed tax returns for years? Is the IRS coming to your home or place of business? The IRS will relentlessly pursue you for unpaid taxes. I'm Patrick Cox, founder of Taxmasters. Listen, don't take on the IRS by yourself. Our former IRS agents and tax professionals have helped many good people just like you. Don't wait weeks for an appointment. Call Taxmasters right now to get started. Call 1-800-307-4310. That's 1-800-307-4310. Or go to txmstr.com.
Hi, welcome to Lowe's. How can I help you?
Yes, I heard about your 5% off everyday credit offer.
That's right. Just use your Lowe's consumer credit card to get 5% off every day. Or choose special financing on purchases of $299 or more.
5% off every day? So Columbus Day?
Discover all the things you can get 5% off on.
Arbor Day?
Buy a tree, get 5% off.
St. Patrick's Day?
You'll save lots of green with 5% off.
Awesome.
Lowe's. Let's build something together. Subject to credit approval. Offers cannot be combined. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.
Running a business is not for the faint of heart. Competition is fierce, margins are thin, and what you don't know can hurt you. That's why 6 million businesses worldwide are Sage. Software and connected services from Sage make business smarter and business life easier. A Sage business knows what's happening inside the numbers. What does it take to turn insight into income? A Sage business knows. Get in the know. Visit sagebusinessknows.com to learn how to make your business Sage.
Are you a baby boomer or an empty nester? Were you born between 1946 and 1960? If so, you are a perfect candidate for the new techniques called tooth-conserving dentistry. These new techniques help eliminate the need for root canals, crowns, or caps, even if your teeth are already damaged or have large fillings. The new techniques can even replace missing teeth without dentures, partials, or bridges. Call for a free consultation. 801-254-0835. That's 801-254-0835.
Exposing politics as pro wrestling. Welcome to Mental Self-Defense Radio and the Jake Shannon radio program. Now, here's your host, Jake Shannon.
5-1, baby. 1 and 5. Welcome back. We are back into hour 2 of Mental Self-Defense Radio. I'm your host, Jake Shannon. I am thrilled to be joined by Jeffrey Rogers Hummell. Jeff Hummell is he's an associate professor of economics over at San Jose State University. He is a hardcore libertarian. He's written a great book on the history of the Civil War with the implications for liberty. The name of the book, Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men, A History of the American Civil War. But the reason why I have Jeff with us today is to share, it's really relevant, it's something that Jeff has been talking about for decades now, and that is the inevitability that the United States will declare bankruptcy, that we will, in other words, repudiate our debt. Professor Hummell, are you still with us?
I am.
Okay, thank you so much for spending so much time and explaining these ideas. So you really think that it's the moral case that, in fact, from a libertarian perspective, we should welcome this repudiation, this bankruptcy, because it will, in effect, stop the entitlement programs that have been crippling us for so long.
Right. One way of putting it is that a default is a balanced budget amendment with real teeth. Now, that's not entirely true, because governments manage to, after they default, do often manage to borrow again. But it just makes investors more wary, and the more difficult it is for government to borrow, the more difficult it will be for government to grow. One other aspect of the moral case that I want to quickly mention is that, remember when we talked about government debt, we said that the Treasury securities are the assets, the offsetting liabilities are future taxes owed by the general public.
Yes.
And if you calculate, the present value of those taxes, they're approximately equal to the value of the debt. So a repudiation of the debt essentially means that the holders of Treasury securities lose, but taxpayers gain.
Right.
And
so as a libertarian, somebody who thinks that taxation is slavery or theft or whatever, that this is a moral thing.
Yeah, and the economic effect of that in the long run should be that the value of private assets, including human capital, should rise by approximately the same amount of the decline in the value of the Treasury securities. And so I think the long-term effect on the economy will not be negative, but in fact, given the inefficiency of government at manipulating the economy and government intervention, I think the long-term effect will be economically beneficial.
Huh. I hadn't really thought about it in terms of the present value of future tax revenues.
Right.
And that's a really clever argument. Okay. So we now have the case why it's actually the right thing to declare this bankruptcy. From a pro-liberty standpoint, I think most people get caught up saying, well, how can it be moral? We agreed to pay this, and I understand their side of it, but this actually makes a lot of sense.
Well, think of it this way. In other words, actually, in my view, if we were to do, which is not going to happen, but let's say we were to put the U.S. government through a well-organized liquidation.
Yes.
My view is that Social Security recipients should actually take primacy over holders of Treasury securities. The reason being that the Social Security recipients were forced into the system. In other words, they were forced to pay payroll taxes.
Whereas the Treasury purchaser, they did it, even so-called risk-free investment or whatever, guaranteed, there's still a knowledge that it was voluntary and it could go.
Right. They made a voluntary decision to invest in the government, and to the extent that you think taxation is illegitimate, it's equivalent to someone in the pre-Civil War period investing in slavery. If you invested in slavery, you earned a rate of return. You had an expected future. Well, the present value of the slave was the present value of the future income that the slave was going to generate for you. And so that was a voluntary transaction, but nobody would think that the slaveholder is due that return.
Well, and this even gets into a bit of Lysander Spooner and some social contract theory insofar as that, hey, I never signed off on these treasuries being sold or whatever.
That's right. Yeah, in fact, actually, so I think that the Social Security beneficiaries, Social Security recipients deserve a primacy in terms of getting payments, but I don't think the payments should come from any future taxes. They should first come from liquidating the assets of the U.S. government, and then, again, something that's not going to happen except in a utopian ideal world, I would make the politicians who voted for these programs and the presidents who signed the laws personally liable up to the entire amount of their...
I love it. You're right, it'll never happen, but that's awesome.
Rather than taxpayers.
I love it. That because then that puts the culpability with the decision maker.
Right.
Yeah, boy, it's hard to defy that logic. I can't say I disagree with that at all. And as a matter of fact, I've long held that liquidation of assets is a huge, weapon that we have that we can kind of unleash against this problem. So here I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. So. Obviously, we were talking, so who are some of these libertarians that are in favor of deflation? I'd love to know them, so I can circle wagons.
I don't know of very many libertarians who are in favor of deflation.
Well, in favor of it happening in terms of a positive sense.
I know of some libertarian analysts who are predicting that deflation is more likely than inflation.
That's what I meant.
The names off the top of my head. I can't bring any names to mind, but but what I do know is that there is a division among libertarians as to whether there's going to be whether the quantitative easing of the Fed is actually going to result in significant inflation or not.
Well, I know that you've written a number of articles. I think you and David Henderson, is that right? About
David Henderson, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I am in the same camp, although I think I have maybe a different angle. I'm just seeing that all that TARP money just went to shore up the bad derivative positions of the banks. That's why it never trickled out. That's why we never saw any inflation on the street. But for our listeners, maybe talk a little bit about your argument as to why all this TARP stuff, why it never really manifested in
Okay, well, inflation. You have to distinguish between what the Fed did and what the Treasury did. And the TARP was essentially a Treasury program in which they bought shares in the banks. And what's happened with the TARP money is that most of that money has been recovered by the government. And the reason, the explanation for that is that when the financial crisis occurred, you had a kind of panic in the financial system where nobody knew where the losses were located, and so the value of a lot of financial assets was collapsing. But now, as the dust has settled, the losses are better identified, and the total collapse in the value of financial assets far exceeded any estimate of what the losses from the subprime mortgage crisis would be, and the fact that the banks are recovering, the fact that the Fed is actually earning money on its holdings of mortgage-backed securities rather than losing money is an indication. I mean, there are losses, but the losses are not of the magnitude that many people anticipated. That's the story with TARP. Now, with respect to the Federal Reserve, the reason that the Federal Reserve did this at the end of 2008 made the largest increase in the monetary base that it's ever generated in its entire history. And that would have been an inflationary step. But at the same time, the Federal Reserve began paying interest on the reserves that the banks hold. In other words,
so the money was good. So despite the increase, there was this offsetting decrease.
So in other words, you had one step that in and of itself would have been inflationary, one step paying interest on reserves that, other things being equal, would have been deflationary, and the two approximately offset each other. And now that the Fed is paying interest on reserves, the Fed essentially has another tool restraining inflation and restraining the growth of the broader measures of the money stock. So if you just look at the monetary base, you see this huge overhang, and you expect that, well, when it starts, when the banks start loaning out money, that's going to generate a huge amount of inflation. But that ignores the fact that the Fed has this additional tool that can, the Fed can raise the interest it pays on reserves as interest rates go up in the economy, and can give the banks an incentive not to loan out the money.
Yeah, see, this totally supports what I've always believed, that because Rothbard stopped writing about these issues so early on, everybody's thinking about the Fed is stuck in the mid-'90s.
A bit of an exaggeration, but yes, essentially, I think that's true of a lot of libertarians.
I'm not talking about the wonks. I'm talking about your typical person who just buys the books and is interested.
Right.
Okay, so this is fascinating stuff. Now, okay, Jeff.
But I don't think you're going to see. I don't think. I mean, inflation is possible, and a Treasury default may generate some inflation, even without a change in monetary policy, through its impact on people's expectations.
But the destruction of debt, which is essentially what a repudiation is deflationary, no?
Not in and of itself. All it is a transfer. It's a transfer, in other words, I repudiate the $1,000 I owe you, you're $1,000 poorer, I'm $1,000 richer.
Yes, right.
So it doesn't in and of itself result in significant deflation. I think that the Fed doesn't, central banks in general are very wary of allowing any kind of deflation, and I do believe they still have the tools to prevent significant deflation, if by deflation what you mean is actually falling prices.
Yeah, by deflation, what I mean is that, for example, at these Treasury auctions, up until very recently, Treasuries were yielding zero. People were buying and they were selling out.
Right.
And it wasn't because the reason was obviously if there's a zero yield, the investors aren't worried about they're not worried about the return on the investment. They're actually saying, hey, I'm just stoked, or maybe my view is deflationary, that just holding this asset will actually make me richer, which is what I mean by deflation. Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, the financial crisis involved a huge scramble for liquidity, and as a result, you had banks holding a lot of money and people moving into treasuries, and the yield on short-term treasuries going very, very low. But the kind of deflation that the U.S. experienced during the Great Depression, where you had over 4 years a fall in the price level of approximately 25%, I don't think that's in the offing. I mean, forecasting is very tricky, in part because it's affected by what the central banks do and what the government does. But I don't think that price deflation is at this stage a significant worry.
Interesting. So those people like me who still have to pay out debt on, say, school loans, we're not going to. That money is not going to be worth more that we pay. Because obviously, I'm all for inflation. Please, go inflate,
yeah.
So I can pay off my debts.
I don't think so. If we have a deflationary crisis, that would be would be a very serious economic hit.
Yeah, that's what scares me. Now, coming back after the break, I want to ask you about the Civil War, because this is another thing that you turned me on to that woke me up to the standard propaganda that Lincoln was a bad guy. Come on back. We're with Jeffrey Rogers Hummell, Mental Self-Defense Radio.
AM 630, K-Talk. When you're talking ethics, integrity, and honesty, you're talking K-Talk.
Hi, this is Naya, the computer girl from PC Laptops. Have you ever been to a big box store and everybody simply ignores you? Then, when you finally hunt down a salesperson, they ask, "Do you have an appointment?" Uh-oh. Then, after all of that brain damage, they try to sell you a rip-off extended warranty on a computer that's supposed to be good in the first place. So you take it home, and you have no clue how to get all your photos and business files transferred. You call the 1-800 number, and they say, we don't cover setup, but if you want, you can give us tons of money, make an appointment for us to set it up. At PC Laptops, all new desktop computers come with a lifetime parts and labor warranty. Moving over to your pictures and music, spyware removal, all covered for free. No rip-off extended warranty or appointment needed. So get into any of our 9 locations right now, or call us at 1-877-596-SAVE, or check us out at PCLaptops.com, because at PC Laptops, we really love you.
Let's be real. Smoking sucks. It's a nasty, expensive, unattractive, and thoroughly unhealthy habit. There's the acrid smell in your clothes and on your breath. Yuck. Not to mention the increased health risk that cigarette smoke presents to those nearest and dearest to you. Call Salt Lake City Family Hypnosis now for your free consultation to learn how you can quit today. 801-738-5390. That's Salt Lake City Family Hypnosis, 801-738-5390.
Only one Salt Lake restaurant is #1 for their award-winning halibut and chips. The same restaurant was even voted best chowder in Utah. It's Summer Hayes Halibut and Chips and Holiday. At Summer Hayes Halibut, we have seafood Louis salads, coconut shrimp and chips, fresh crab cakes, grilled salmon, calamari, and fresh-made crab bisque, plus burgers, turkey and chicken sandwiches, smoothies, and even fried Twinkies. See the entire menu at summerhayshalibut.com. Treat yourself to the fresh taste of the best Alaskan halibut in the heart of holiday across from Macy's. Summer Hayes Halibut and Chips. For lunch and dinner, Monday through Saturday, Salt Lake's best seafood, Summer Hayes Halibut and Chips.
The voice of Utah. AM 630 K-Talk.
K-Talk.com.
#1 for the most live, local, two-way talk.
Mental Self-Defense Radio. I'm your host, Jake Shannon. With me, Jeffrey Rogers Hummell. Jeff, sorry I don't have Oingo Boingo for the bumpers for you. I would have done that for you, because I know you're passionate for all things Oingo Boingo. Now, I'm totally with this being actually for the default now. I'm totally excited. This almost reminds me of, why I'm for getting rid of the, what's so crazy is that even if, it's moral to do that. I love the argument. Just like it's moral to get rid of the income tax and replace it with nothing, no sales tax, no VAT, nothing like that. Because when you actually look at the numbers, it just takes us back, it's 40% right off the top of revenues, which obviously that money saved in our pockets would go to bring the economy back. But that would just take it to a government the size that it was under Bill Clinton in 97. And we had plenty of bombs and welfare programs back then. I mean, it just tells you how crazy our growth of our government's become. Now, in your book, Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men, you were the first guy to turn me on, well before guys like Tom DiLorenzo and all these other libertarians talking about what a villain Lincoln was. Maybe for our listeners, those who haven't been turned on to that, what was the role of the Civil War in kind of the history of liberty here in the United States?
Okay, before I get into that, I do want to qualify this because I'm a little bit hesitant about saying Lincoln was a bad guy, or Lincoln was a villain. In other words, I have a libertarian interpretation of the Civil War, and I don't want to simplify that into just Lincoln bashing.
Sure.
Because in part because a lot of the policies that Lincoln followed would have been followed by other presidents in the same situation. But my argument essentially is that the Civil War was a mixed event in American history.
Well, your title certainly leaves little quarter.
Right. Well, in other words, the Civil War represents the simultaneous culmination and repudiation of the American Revolution. Culmination of the American Revolution in that the Civil War did bring about the abolition of chattel slavery. And I think that's an accomplishment that cannot be overestimated in significance. But at the same time, it also, I think the Civil War, rather than the New Deal or World War I or the Progressive Era, represents the turning point in American history where government power, rather than receding, begins to start growing. First of all, during the war, you had an enormous increase in the power of government at all levels, through conscription, through heavy taxes, including the federal government's first income tax, through restrictions on civil liberties, through regulation of the economy. And afterwards, you had a post-war ratchet effect in which the government didn't return to pre-war levels in terms of its size and intrusiveness, but also you had a reversal of the long-term trend in which, rather than government slowly being whittled away, it began to grow. So that was the cost of the Civil War, and I think that was a significant cost. Now, if you were to pose the hypothetical question to me of if I thought that cost was necessary to get rid of slavery, was it worth it? I would have to answer yes, because I consider slavery to have been such a vile and evil institution. But one of the arguments that I make in the book is that the abolition of slavery, the Civil War was not necessary about the abolition of slavery. In other words,
that it was economically untenable.
A combination of economically and politically untenable. In other words, the old argument is that slavery was unprofitable and therefore dying out, and that's not true. Slavery was very profitable for slaveholders, but it was profitable for slaveholders because it enjoyed a whole bunch of subsidies and benefits from governments at all levels, and even the federal government. And so what I'm essentially arguing is that if at the time the South seceded, and by the way, I do concede that if you're asking the question of why did the South secede, the answer is primarily over slavery. But there's a second question. Why did the North refuse to let the South go? And the answer there is not slavery. The answer there was this commitment to union and this sort of mystical identification of union and liberty. And if Northerners had been interested in getting rid of slavery rather than preserving the Union, my argument is that there is a set of policies that they could have adopted, which at the same time letting the lower South go in peace, that would have brought down slavery in an independent Confederacy, certainly by the turn of the century, and possibly within 4 years, which is how long the Civil War lasted. So it's a little bit more complicated and nuanced an argument than that the Civil War that Abraham Lincoln was
all bad. Say
all bad. Yes.
Yeah, sure. Now, if it's okay with you, it's very seldom that my listeners get to actually talk to somebody who has a master's in history, a PhD in history, and in addition to that is also a professor of economics and is a specialist in the Civil War. I've got a guy who is a big Civil War buff. Are you okay to take a call, Jeff?
I'm happy to take a call. I was wondering when I was going to get to take calls.
Okay, hold on. I've got Arkansas Dave on the line. Are you there, Dave?
Yeah, it doesn't sound like your guest is much of a professor of history. I guess he claims to be. They had a lady on who's a professor. I was going to talk about it. She was from somewhere, University of North Carolina, last Memorial Day, and she was going over all the state right abuses of the Confederacy.
Now, Dave, hold on. Have you actually read Dr. Hummell's book?
No.
Okay, so there's one strike against you. Two, the University of Texas.
I'm not playing baseball. Okay, so there, but the lady went on. The states finally figured out that this was a takeover and not their liberation, because Georgia was the example she used. They set up a militia, a 16,000-man militia, and the Georgia governor did it to keep the Confederate states from getting a hold of those 16,000-man force. And the Confederate Secretary of War said, no, those are mine. Them and all the firearms they own are mine. And she went through all of these abuses, and my God, this swelling up of the big government was postponed by the Civil War. The example I use is the Arthur Tillman hanging in Paris, Arkansas, back in 1914. But they had that trial in Paris, Arkansas, and with two appeals, that took a month and a half to the governor. He was executed in downtown Paris, Arkansas, a month and a half later. Now, this is 1914. How do you get this, that the Civil War created a big government? It was the Confederacy that was the big centralized government, and the fact that the people that are trying to sell it as states' rights are the same people who are trying to tell us that the Al-Qaeda is attacking us from the Middle East. It's a big lie.
Okay, well, actually, I agree with you about the Confederacy. I mean, one of the arguments I make in the book is that war is the health of the state, and so the Confederacy and the Union were virtually mirror images of each other in terms of centralization of power. And in some respects, the Confederacy was more centralized than the Union.
Far more.
My argument is not that the Confederacy represented any kind of ideal libertarian utopia. My argument is neither pro-Confederate nor pro-Union. It's simply anti-war. And after the war, if you look at government at state levels or at the federal level, you see this obvious increase in government power. I mean, to run through a couple of...
I don't see it.
Wait, let me just finish. I gave you a chance to make your point. First of all, the first national income tax is imposed during the Civil War. Second of all, you get all sorts of internal excise taxes that the federal government imposes. Prior to the Civil War, the federal government collected no internal taxes. Its only sources of revenue was a tariff and the sale of public lands. During the Civil War, you get the beginning of the federal regulation of banking with the creation of the national banking system. You get federal subsidies to railroads with the subsidization of the transcontinental railroads. You get federal aid to education with the Morrill Land Grant Act. You get widespread conscription, which was both true in the Confederacy and in the Union. You get a whole new range of government agencies. You get the Department of Agriculture created during the Civil War. I mean, just...
May I make a short comment, and then I'll listen to the rest off air?
Okay.
If you look at the Arthur Tillman case from Paris, Arkansas, if you look at the famous Joe Hill case here in Utah, you see local communities conducting their own business without any interference from the federal government.
Look, it's not a question of black. It's not a question of black and white. Government power goes along a spectrum, and I'm not making the simplistic argument that the Civil War created the welfare warfare state that we live under today. That was a long process. The claim I am making is that if you compare the level of government intrusion, not only at the federal level but at the state and local level, prior to the Civil War and after the Civil War, government was clearly more intrusive after the Civil War. And
have you ever heard of the Whiskey Rebellion under George Washington?
Pardon?
The Whiskey Rebellion, the Whiskey Tax Rebellion under George Washington?
Right.
You've never heard of that? That was.
Of course, I've heard of that. I know
that was about 7 years before Lincoln.
Pardon?
What's that? That was about 70 years before Lincoln.
That's right. And as a result of the Whiskey Rebellion, you had the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800, and what did Jefferson do? He repealed all the internal taxes. So you never had a whiskey tax from Jefferson's election until the Civil War, and it's the Civil War that brought it back. That reinforces my argument. My argument listen, if you listen to me, my argument again is that prior to the Civil War, the general long-run trend was to get rid of various government interventions, like the whiskey tax, and that after the Civil War, the long-run trend was increasing government intervention.
My last comment, and I got to run, is the Libertarian Party is obsessed with the Civil War to a point of absurdity. They never talk about the Spanish-American War of 1898. They never talk about the Korean War, World War I. They are obsessed with the fact that they could not win the Civil War. Thank you very much.
Okay,
some libertarians may be obsessed with the Civil War, but I would make the same point about World War I, which represents the apogee of central planning in American history, and the same point about the Spanish-American War. Just because I'm critical of the policies that result from the Civil War doesn't mean that that I ignore some of the unfortunate policies that resulted from other American wars, including World War II and the War on Terror.
Yeah, I think that's more of a psychological confession, Jeff, than anything. I think that he clearly has a passion for his position about the Civil War, and as such, anybody who criticizes it automatically is a bad guy. But I knew that was going to be. I appreciate your patience with him. I didn't really came on saying you weren't much of a professor. I think you pretty much nailed that with the Whiskey Rebellion and the election of Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, it's difficult sometimes to talk about these issues too. I mean, I'm sure you find as a professional intellectual to try to have these conversations and wake people up to these facts because people get so attached to certain outcomes emotionally.
Yes and no. I mean, some people are more attached to. I mean, people are different, and you have people who are less tolerant of discussion on all ends of the political spectrum.
Okay, well, you're getting your wish. Now we got Martin in Salt Lake who wants to ask you about to clarify something on a statement about slavery. Martin, you're on the air. You're on Mental Self-Defense Radio. How are you?
Yeah, hi. I had a question that, because in my, I mean, I obviously haven't studied near what this gentleman has, but my understanding is on slavery. I know, reading Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, he kind of made it about slavery, and he didn't free the slaves of the North. He only freed the slaves of the dissenting states, and so I'm not, I don't think it was really a difference between slavery between the North and the South. I think that that was just a political ploy that Lincoln used. That's one thing, and then also the North was taking a whole lot of taxes from the South, and not, was kind of raping them, with the tax situation and stuff, and they weren't able to make their own decisions with the taxation because the North was basically taking it, and so that was my understanding, and maybe you can help set me straight.
Okay. With respect to the first question, the way I would put it, I mean, you're right about the Emancipation Proclamation being officially limited in its impact. So the way I would describe it is that the abolition of slavery was not the reason that the North went to war and decided to prevent the South from seceding, but it became an unintended consequence of the war, partially because there were a lot of Northerners who felt that slavery was the cause of secession. So you have sort of a progression of steps that take place during the Civil War that result in slavery being abolished by the end of the war. The Emancipation Proclamation technically didn't free slaves in those slave states that hadn't seceded, and didn't free slaves in many areas of the Confederacy that the Union had already occupied. But it helped to bring down slavery because it turned the Union armies into a beacon for runaway slaves.
Now, we're coming up against a break here. Can you hang on for a second, Martin, and hopefully Professor Hummell can get to you after the break on the second part?
Sure, thank you.
Okay, hold on just a sec. We'll be back. Mental Self-Defense Radio, K-Talk, the voice of Utah.
AM 630, K-Talk. We live where you live. We shop where you shop. Thanks for supporting the sponsors of K-Talk Radio.
63% of Americans are overweight. If you've decided it's time to leave your flat behind, HipFit Weight Loss is for you. HipFit changes habits. Lose the bad habits, lose the weight. HipFit is guaranteed to make your weight loss successful and has absolutely no health risks. HipFit students are not required to count calories, weigh portions, or buy specialty food. Start losing weight immediately. Call 801-635-4488. HipFit is conveniently located at Salt Lake City Family Hypnosis. Ask about our Guaranteed to Stop Smoking program. 801-635-4488.
Have you ever felt that your smile is the least attractive part of your body? Did you ever dream of having a smile makeover but just couldn't afford it? If so, you are a perfect candidate for the new technique called Instant Smile Makeover. Recent advances in technology can give you straight, white teeth that will look beautiful for a lifetime without the need for braces, bleaching, drilling, or numbing. The new techniques can fix crooked teeth and make them straight in one visit. Don't be embarrassed about your smile any longer. Sometimes Mother Nature just needs a little help. Call for a free consultation. Call 801-254-0835. That's 801-254-0835.
The voice of Utah. AM 630 K-Talk.
K-Talk.com.
Number one for the most live, local, two-way talk.
I got your number on the wall.
All right, Mental Self-Defense Radio. I'm your host, Jake Shannon. We've got with us Jeffrey Rogers Hummell. He's been a big influence on my thinking. He's a hardcore libertarian, but he's also got a Ph.D. in history, master's in history. He's an associate professor of economics at San Jose State. And Jeff, you've actually gotten your wish. Now the phones are blowing up. So anybody who's calling and the lines are busy or the line's not being answered, just keep calling back. So long story short, we were talking with Martin from Salt Lake City, talking about the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right. He had two questions, one about slavery in the Civil War and one about taxes in the Civil War. To wrap up my answer about slavery in the Civil War, I think Lincoln was a politician who at the same time was sincerely opposed to slavery, but would only do what was politically viable. In other words, like all politicians, he was a complex combination of lofty ideals and crass opportunism. But the result is that at the end of the war, 4 million slaves had achieved freedom, and even if that's an unintended consequence, I still think that that's an important gain for liberty. With respect to taxes, you have to put taxes in perspective. At the time of the Civil War, the only tax that the U.S. government collected was a tariff. Total expenditures at the federal level were about 1.5% of GDP, so the tax wasn't that high. It is true, economists have, economic theory demonstrates that the incidence of a tax, of a tariff, falls heavily on exporters. So if you look at the relative burden of the tax, Southerners paid had a heavier burden from the tariff than did Northerners. But since the North had a much larger population, it turns out that the North paid most of the tax. And the tax issue was not really a cause of Southern secession because, in fact, Southerners had won on the tariff issue before the Civil War. Tariffs had been steadily reduced from the nullification crisis under President Andrew Jackson, so that tariffs were at their lowest level in U.S. history up until that time, prior to the Civil War. It's not true that the South seceded because tariffs went up. In fact, it's the reverse. Because the South seceded, tariffs went up.
Does that answer your question, Martin?
Yeah, that does. I still kind of feel like the North, was being hypocritical in the slavery issue, and also I felt like the South had every right to say, look, we want to go somewhere else. We want to be our own. And I felt like it was pretty narcissistic of Lincoln to say, well, I mean, basically, I'm sure he didn't know it would turn out as bad as it did, but for, 500 and something thousand people on both sides, between each side to die, so 500,000 or so Americans die just because you want to keep the Union together. I don't know. Maybe I have a little misunderstanding.
No, I agree with you entirely about that. I think that the cost of 420,000 deaths just to keep the Union together was pretty reprehensible.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your explanation. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Hey, thanks for the call, Martin. Boy, we've got all kinds of people calling in. We've got Peter in Salt Lake City. Peter, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay, so what's your question?
Yeah, here's another spin on, and you can look this up and see that this system was changed when the Reconstruction Act began after the Civil War, and recorporatized, and it became incorporated.
Oh, so you're talking about how the Charter of the United States changed and whatnot?
Yeah, it's not the true original government, and you can look up on teamlaw.org or the Corporation Nation and look up those sites and check out what we really have, what really happened.
Okay, hey,
what we're doing.
Thanks for the call, Peter. Jeff, what's your take on that? Are we still under the same laws, or was there some big charter change?
Let me think about how to answer that. There were significant changes, and one of the changes was that sort of the federal system was replaced by a more consolidated system, an American nation state. But I don't want to exaggerate the extent of the change, as the first caller pointed out. The state and local governments still exercised a considerable degree of autonomy after the Civil War. It's just not as much as before the Civil War, and it steadily declined afterwards.
Okay, and interesting. Now we've got Zach from West Jordan. Zach, you are on Mental Self-Defense today.
Hey, I'm really good, thanks. Appreciate it. I just wanted to comment really quickly on just the importance of the libertarian ideology, just how a lot of these people just kind of think, oh, we need to raise the debt ceiling, we need to do these different things, and how it's important to have that third point of view, and that's what really has turned me on to the idea of libertarianism, is that without that other outside influence, the Republicans or the Democrats just seem to kind of go run amok. And I just really love, I never thought of letting the debt ceiling just kind of go, It's just really kind of a neat idea that we allow ourselves to just kind of look at all the different viewpoints. And I know I'm an Aggie myself, but I love the San Jose State guy just out there saying this is the way it's going to be, And so I really appreciate that point of view. I'll let you guys comment off the air, but I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the show and also all the guests that come on and how they really just kind of put things in a better light, because it's not black and white. There's a bright tapestry of what our nation is, and I think we need to get back to the keys of who we are, what we're about, and to just really get down to our nation, not about nation building and all these other neocons and all these other different things, and just to really focus on who we are as a nation. So I'll let you guys comment off the air, so thanks a lot.
Hey, thanks, Zach.
You bet.
Yeah, that's the whole thing with this show, that I try to turn people on to people like Jeff here, who are just having a conversation with Jeff. I feel my IQ, my intelligence quotient raising a few points. And that's what I'm trying to do, is to have people understand that, sometimes conversations like this require more than a soundbite. Jeff, we've got about, maybe 7 or 8 minutes left. Now, you have some other interesting ideas. I mean, you're obviously, the economy inside and out, American history, particularly the Civil War, inside and out. But one of your interests that I'm interested in as a libertarian more broadly are your ideas on national defense and how that can be provided. I was wondering if maybe
you're gonna try to cover everything in 2 hours.
I've got large aspirations here, so. So now, granted, we only have about 7 or 8 minutes.
Yeah,
and I know
7
that's
or 8
not...
minutes, and you gave me the toughest problem of all to handle in 7 or 8 minutes.
So for those people who aren't up on it,
unfortunately, I am going to be reduced to a soundbite.
I'm sorry. I tried, but boy, you got so much information, and I've only got 2 hours. If I had a third hour, we could give you the whole hour on it.
Right. Basically. There are two types of libertarians: those who believe that we should have a voluntarily funded government, and those who believe that that voluntary activity and private institutions are sufficient to provide all services, including defense. Often they refer to themselves as anarcho-capitalists. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I'm an anarchist. I believe that everything that the government does can be divided into two categories. Things like taxation, conscription, busting people for using drugs that ought not to be done at all, and things like providing charity, welfare, education that could be done better either by market institutions or by private philanthropic voluntary institutions. I believe that national defense falls into the latter category, and therefore I'm in favor of unconditional disarmament of the U.S. government down to the last squirt gun.
Now, this is the thing that I think that, I try to do is that, words have meaning. And for most people, and a lot of times that meaning is, its beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And as such, for most people who aren't as schooled as you, or people that aren't as much into libertarian political theory, they see an anarchist and they think that you're one of the ding-dongs at the G20 throwing Molotov cocktails through department store windows, or maybe even that you've got a beard and a bomb and a black hat. But really, philosophical anarchism just basically is saying that we should end all coercion. That it's
we should
all
end all
about
coercion.
voluntary.
I think that the term anarchism can mean in some contexts just getting a society without a monopoly coercive government. For other people, it means violence and chaos. Obviously, I'm using the term in the first meaning, with the first meaning. And I think a way of clarifying this is to make a distinction between law and government. Most supporters of government believe that you need a single monopoly government in order to have a peaceful society with a rule of law. And my study of history tells me that government is neither a necessary nor sufficient condition to have a peaceful society under the rule of law. In other words, you can have a legal system that encompasses independent, autonomous organizations, and you can have peace break down under a single monopoly government, as it did during the American Civil War.
Yeah, right. And so a lot of times this gets to the point about competing governments or competing security agencies, which seems to be a big issue. And one of your things is about how we could provide a national defense without the government doing it.
Yeah, I don't even want to call it a national defense, because national has embedded in it certain, I think, concepts that are not useful in terms of thinking about this problem. Basically, let me put it this way. I'm not intrinsically interested in where the capital of the government is located, whether it's Washington, D.C., Tokyo, Moscow, or Baghdad. I'm interested in how oppressive the government is. Or to put it in simple terms, I'm interested in the tax rate. And I think that national defense, what goes by the name of national defense, is really a subset of a more general problem. How do you protect yourself from government? How do you protect yourself from the effort of nearly all governments to intrude into your daily life, expropriate your resources, and boss you around?
That's a great question because it addresses foreign governments and our government.
You're right. In other words, I think that was exactly the point I was going to make. That whether the government is a foreign government or a domestic government becomes a secondary consideration. And I think once you frame the problem that way, then you can begin to see, if you focus on what are the mechanisms that protect us to the extent that they do from the depredations of the U.S. government, those are the same mechanisms that we should rely on to protect us from the depredations of foreign governments.
Okay, now here's the upshot of just teasing the people with this idea, which is provocative. Where can they learn more about your writings on these ideas? I mean, you have a website, jrhummell.com. What's the best way for people who are interested in your ideas to learn more about, what you want to teach?
Well, I would say start at my faculty website, which is on the San Jose State University.
Yeah, but they can link to it from
and
your
that links
site.
to my personal web page, and also my Independent Institute web page. And if you go to the Independent Institute,
okay, which is independent.org.
Yeah, and then call up my name, search my name. They have a list of my articles.
Oh, great!
And that I published in the Independent Review, and one of those articles is on the national defense issue. It's not the only article I've written on the subject, but it's the most accessible one and the most recent one. And
so, again, they would just go to independent.org, type in Jeffrey Rogers Hummell,
right.
Hummel, 1 L at the end,
right?
And then they would be able to see a score of different articles, huh?
Yes.
Great. Hey, Jeff, thank you so much for taking so much time with me and the listeners here. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome. I enjoyed it. I had a great time.
Okay, hopefully we'll get you back and maybe we can pick your brain some more. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeffrey Rogers Hummell, that is it for us. We won't be back until Monday. Come on back then.
AM 630,